Last time on the Rick James story, from dodging war to escaping jail, from drug deals and failed record contracts, to narrowly escaping a deadly brush with Charles Manson himself, Rick James had finally clawed his way into the spotlight. But now, the spotlight burns. In this final chapter, Rick's world unravels into obsession, addiction, and a level of darkness even his fans couldn't imagine. The crimes grow more violent, the behavior more disturbing, and what's revealed here will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. This is the fall of Rick James, and it's not for the faint of heart. What you're about to witness is real. One petty beef. Born at 80 miles per hour, Rick James didn't just cross paths with Prince that day. He caught a glimpse of the competition, and he didn't like it, not one bit. Rick James was used to being the biggest, boldest thing in any room, until one day on one highway, he met someone just as bold, just as bad, and maybe even better. Rick never forgot that first encounter, and he sure as hell never forgave it. From that moment on, Rick wasn't just chasing fame anymore. He was chasing a grudge. Funny thing is, Rick liked Prince when Prince debuted his second album and loved his song, I Wanna Be Your Lover. He saw videos of him performing and thought this dude was very talented, and he reminded him of himself in many ways, especially as a multiplayer musician. He'd heard that Prince said he was influenced by him, so highly flattered, Rick decided to take him on and invited him to be an opening act on his Fire It Up tour. Almost immediately, trouble brewed. Rick was extremely offended because he'd invited Prince to open for him, and he expected him to come to his dressing room personally to thank him for the opportunity, and Prince never did. Then this started the lifelong one-sided beef that Rick had with Prince. It didn't help that Prince at 21 was 10 years younger than Rick and had already been slightly successful in the business, whereas Rick and his band were in their 30s and just getting started, seeing success. Rick felt like he had something to prove and had to constantly try to one-up Prince. One time before showtime, Prince was playing drums to warm up. Rick chuckled, laughing at him, thinking he was actually doing something. Rick came in and sat on his drum set and began to play. He said Prince was angry and stormed off stage, and of course, Rick was proud of himself. Prince was also a very pretty man, and his daintiness seemed to really bother Rick a lot. At first, he claimed to feel bad for him because on a couple of the first couple of tour dates, Prince was getting booed by the fans for wearing bikini underwear, leggings, and a trench coat. They thought he was gay and lame and wasn't really vibing with him. Happy about this and to taunt him, Rick came out on stage to show Prince up and to basically show him how it's done. He'd do a lot of crowd engagement, microphone tricks, and catchy sounds that riled up the crowd. And he'd look back at the curtain to see Prince standing there, watching him. Rick felt he was studying him, and he wasn't wrong. Soon enough later, during the tour, the audience started to really dig Prince now, and Rick and his band started to notice a couple of troubling things. Those very same catchy sounds, microphone tricks, and crowd engagement were very reminiscent of Rick. They felt Prince downright stole his whole vibe. Rick demanded a meeting with Prince and his band where he cussed them out for stealing his moves. He also accused Prince and his band of feeling like they were too good to speak to him and his band. Prince coolly and coldly stated, "My band is here to work," and this really ticked Rick off. To momentarily appease Rick, Prince promised him that they'd speak more often and that he wouldn't steal his moves. But afterwards, Prince continued to do whatever he wanted, and things stayed the same. The one-sided beef started to get out of hand on Rick's behalf. One night he was having a party, and Prince and his band came and crashed the party. While Prince, who didn't drink or do drugs, was sitting at the table, Rick came over, grabbed him by the hair, and threw cognac down his throat. While he laughed, he said Prince spit the drink out and ran away crying. Rick called him a pussy. Rick really had a disdain for Prince. He once was going to beat his ass because Rick's mother Betty was a Prince fan, and she asked Prince for an autograph. Prince said no, and when Rick found out, he stormed over ready to beat his head in. Prince was supposedly scared, stating that he didn't know that she was his mother, and his manager rushed over to calm Rick down. His manager made Prince apologize and give her the autograph. in which Rick walked away feeling like a badass. But Rick found a way to get revenge on Prince for stealing his moves. Prince had a rare set of synthesizers Obex, which a lot of people didn't have at the time. Rick stole them and went down to Miami to work on his new album. As one-sided as this beef was, according to Tina Marie, Rick really loved Prince a lot, but he'd never admit that. In the process of this chaos, Rick had worked on an album called Garden of Love, and it flopped majorly. It flopped so bad that promoters canceled his tour. He had to quickly recalibrate, but he was lacking inspiration. He went back to Los Angeles and decided to go to the hood. He went where all the prostitutes and pimps were. He saw a lot of things that inspired him to write many of the songs that would be on his classic album, Street Songs. This album would touch on topics of ghetto life, police brutality, and sexuality. The song Super Freak started out as a corny joke and something he didn't take seriously at all, but one of the band members thought he had something special there. Then it was suggested to add a new wave sound to the song to hook the white people. While he was in the middle of recording Street Songs, Rick met an Ethiopian model that he became completely smitten with. It's not known for sure, but some believe that this was possibly the iconic model Iman. Rick said they never became intimate because she knew how much of a dog he was, but when he brought her to vacation in Paris and thought they were going to finally get some, she played him, leaving him with blue balls. This caused him to write the classic song, Fire and Desire. Tina Marie thought that he'd wrote it about their relationship, but Rick made it clear that over the years it was never about her, but he'd just laugh at her whenever she'd ask who it was about. But even if it wasn't about her, he definitely wanted her to sing it. She was really sick and hospitalized at the time with a fever of 103. Rick told her that he'd get another girl singer to replace her if she didn't come. Tina hopped out of bed sick, and all did one take of Fire and Desire, and went right back to the hospital. Before the release of Street Songs, Rick did the Funk Fest tour where he was with other major funk stars such as Parliament and Confunction, but Rick was the main draw. Once again, he was able to get revenge on George Clinton and his band for how George played him years ago. Rick made sure to always go on stage before George, and Rick said he would do everything he could possibly do to amp the crowd up and tire them out, so that by the time George came out, many of them walked out on him and went home. And because Rick's ego had gotten so big that he wanted to dominate everything and everyone, and because he was just naturally competitive, he saw that Marvin Gaye was no longer considered the Prince of Motown and that he was now the hot one, so he decided to do some grimy stuff. He started sleeping with Marvin's wife, Jan Gaye, and had a long affair with her for many years. Their relationship was lust and drug-fueled, both being heavy substance users. This caused Marvin to spiral out of control in his own drug-fueled tirades over Marvin and Jan. He'd even done radio interviews airing them out. I also made a video about the wild life of Marvin Gaye and Jan that you can watch here. But Rick didn't care about anyone's feelings, friends, loves, or foes. He was still riding high, making up for all the years he struggled to get here. And the success of Street Songs only cemented his fame and assholery. Give It To Me Baby and Super Freak were hits. And he was an asshole to almost everyone without hesitation, and would only respect one if they defended themselves against him. For example, while on his Street Songs tour, he used to use Tina Marie to come on stage to sing Fire and Desire, which was a major part of the show, the audience favorite, but he refused to pay her. After a while, Tina refused to come on stage unless he paid her $10,000 first. He refused to, but when the audience demanded this performance, Rick's brother paid Tina the $10,000, and she did it. This pissed Rick off, and he stormed backstage to confront her. Because his sister defended Tina's decision, he tried to beat the brakes off of her, but she threatened him. Rick, playing victim, couldn't believe that his own sister went against him on behalf of Tina, and he was surprised that Tina stood up against him. But as angry as he was at these people, he respected them for standing up to him. Things started to get shaky for Rick, though. He started to do worse drugs. While he was in Chicago, he got severely hooked on freebase, and this sent his world upside down. He'd be more addicted to this than anything he'd done. He'd actually overdosed many times throughout the years, but it never made the news. In the early 1980s, MTV largely refused to play black artists outside of Michael Jackson. Rick James, who was one of the biggest R&B and funk artists of the time, was furious that the network refused to play his music videos, especially for his hit song Super Freak. He called them out publicly, accusing MTV of blatant racism and saying they were trying to be a rock-only channel to cater to white audiences. In multiple interviews, he said, "A lot of black artists have been trying to get on MTV, but we're being treated like we don't exist." But instead of giving in to his demands, MTV retaliated in a way that stung even more. They put Prince in heavy rotation instead. Because Prince and Rick James had such a heated rivalry, when MTV was criticized for not playing black artists instead of playing Super Freak, they chose to push Prince's Little Red Corvette instead, a more pop-friendly song that fit their image. This enraged Rick, as he felt MTV was using his rival to snub him. Rick James later said, "They made an example out of me. Instead of playing Super Freak, they played the hell out of Prince." To make things worse, MTV didn't even allow Rick James onto the network until years later, and only because Eddie Murphy's song Party All the Time, which Rick James produced, became a hit. But even then, Rick felt like he was only getting airplay because of Eddie Murphy's star power. But we'll come back to that. Despite this battle, Super Freak ended up outlasting the beef. It became one of the most sampled songs in history. In the end, Rick James never fully forgave MTV, believing they tried to erase him from pop culture in favor of artists like Prince. In the process, he saw that Exorcist actress Linda Blair had a crush on him, and they hooked up. He really liked Linda because she allowed him to be free and never nagged him or expected him to be with only her. They had an intense love affair that led to her getting pregnant. She didn't even let Rick know that not only was she pregnant, but that she also aborted it. Rick was torn up about this and felt so betrayed that he wrote the song Cold-Blooded about her and this situation. Then his ex-baby mother Seville came back to his life demanding $5 million. He threatened to steal the kids from her, and this was enough to chase her away for a while. But this shadiness made him hire a private detective to find and spy on Seville and his daughter, and in the process, he found out that he also had a son named Rick Jr. He wanted to be a part of his children's lives and made arrangements to send for them. Seville sent her 2 kids alone on a flight to a father they never knew. And he didn't know them either. When he went to the airport to get them, he picked up 2 children that were not his, causing a woman to become hysterical and screaming at him. When he finally saw them, his fatherly instincts kicked in, or at least tried to, for a little bit. Actually, when he saw that he had 2 kids, he realized that he couldn't or wouldn't take both of them. So according to Tina Marie, Rick told her to take and raise Rick Jr., and he'd take his daughter Taz. And Tina did it. She raised him, and she saw him as her son. But Rick tried to do the dad thing by fixing up their bedrooms and trying to hang out with them, but his rock star urges kept kicking in, and quickly was no place for children. Instead of helping them with homework and other fatherly duties, he'd make them stay in their rooms so that he could take part in wild orgies in the living room. And these orgies were heinous. He and his band members, high off of everything imaginable, had every type of sex you could think of. And Rick was the ultimate ringleader of it all. While one of his band members was being intimate with a woman, Rick came over watching them and coaching them on, and he pulled off his belt and began beating the woman with it. And he was hitting her hard, to the point of drawing blood, and she never asked him to stop, so he kept on. He swung the belt again, accidentally hitting his band member, and this hurt him, and he realized that Rick would go further unless you stood up to him. Because these women never defended themselves, Rick made the BDSM very intense and painful. These types of things happened frequently, and his daughter Ty said walking through the living room past numerous naked women in the mornings was very normal. As much as Rick said he tried to be a good father, he failed. He couldn't stay away from his destructive substances and wild lifestyle. His kids would take a back seat, so he continued to work, and he started working with other people, which meant more money for him. He met Eddie Murphy on the set of Saturday Night Live when Rick performed. Eddie asked him to produce some music for him. Eddie was also a huge Prince fan and wanted to work with him as well. Well, this didn't sit well with Rick, so Rick went on to work with other people. He'd gotten a bright idea that he wanted to compete with Berry Gordy by creating his very own version of the Supremes. He wanted to make a girl group called the Colored Girls, and the personalities would be a dominatrix, a valley girl, a classy dame, and a female version of him. Whether he was high or not, he foolishly told his plans of this creation to Prince's managers. And before Rick knew it, suddenly there was a new girl group on the scene named Vanity 6, and produced from none other than Prince. This pissed Rick off because he knew that once again, Prince had stolen from him. Hating the name, Rick's mother Betty suggested the name the Mary Jane Girls, and they were a hit. The Mary Jane Girls had hits such as All Night Long, Candyman Boy. He ruled them though, and he treated them almost like a pimp. He did not allow them to have sex, and he did not allow them to speak to other people without him being there. He didn't want anyone to get in their ears and make them possibly question their contracts or pay, because he wasn't about being fair or treating people right. In the 1983 Grammy Awards, Rick James and Grace Jones had the pleasure of presenting Best R&B Male Vocalist, and Marvin Gaye happened to be nominated in that category. Knowing the history they had and how Rick had stolen his wife, they finally would meet face to face on the main stage. Marvin Gaye won, and when he went on stage to accept his award, he turned to Rick James and whispered, "That woman gave me the best years of my life." It didn't make Rick feel good, especially when the next year came and Marvin was murdered by his own father. When Rick first heard about Marvin's death, due to Marvin's own history with substance abuse, he thought he passed away from an overdose. So he became paranoid, and this caused Rick to question his own drug use and mortality. Fearing that this bad juju was happening to drug-addicted musicians, Rick vowed to never touch a pipe again. But his sobriety only lasted a day, and Rick had actually OD'd several more times that people don't know about. But as his mother often reminded him, God kept him surviving constantly for a reason. But he was a slave to the substances, and he couldn't break away no matter how many times he tried. And he started to question his actions and influence when he saw just how much he'd been influencing teens with his music and lifestyle. Once, during one of his concert performances, he looked out into the crowd and saw some underage girls being highly inappropriate with themselves in the audience. He was very disgusted and disturbed by what he saw them doing and knew he had a hand in their misbehavior. But as disgusted as he was, that did not stop him from going to have highly inappropriate illegal appointments with them. Ironically, Rick having illegal appointments with underage girls would come back to bite him later on in life as well as after. But even as his star continued to rise and fall, substance abuse had Rick by the neck. He was spiraling out of control. He'd gotten so out of hand that his mother Betty tried to intervene, and fiending so bad, Rick put hands on his own mother. When Rick was in a rehab center, he wanted out so that he could get a fix. The doctors had already let him know that if he left, then he would possibly die. That was a chance Rick was willing to take. When word got back to his mom that Rick was trying to leave, she went there in hopes that he'd listen to her. But he was fiending bad. When Betty tried to get in the way of him getting his fix, he viciously pushed her down to the ground. Both shocked that he'd done this, Rick felt bad, but he needed his fix worse. He immediately went out to purchase his fix. Admittedly, Motown didn't seem to care that Rick was a raging dope fiend. They just wanted him to keep pushing out hits. After all, they were used to their artists being addicts. But Rick was getting to a point where he didn't want to push out any more music. But after Motown threatened to release a greatest hits album so they didn't have to pay him, he quickly gave them some random songs that he had inside his closet. One was a hit called 17 about his relationship with 17-year-old girls. 17 seemed to be the special number for him regarding these relationships, because he soon met a 17-year-old girl by the name of Tanya. She was damaged just like he seemed to like them. She came from a broken home and was hooked on substances just like he was, so they fit each other in dysfunctional hell. Rick said that she re-energized him, made him feel young, and made him want to work on music again. Eddie Murphy came back to him to ask him to produce his album. Rick, being petty, was like, "I thought you were supposed to be working with Prince. What happened with that?" Eddie Murphy claimed that Prince was weird and that he kept staring at him too much. He made him feel very weird around him. This rejection of Prince from Eddie Murphy made Rick happy, and feeling like Prince didn't know what to do with Eddie anyway, Rick took him on. After working with Eddie and trying to find his actual voice, and not impressions of Stevie Wonder and Michael Jackson, Rick was able to pull out a banger. It was called Party All the Time, and it was a big hit. The video of the song had both Eddie and Rick in it, and it played on MTV in heavy rotation. Finally, Rick was able to get on MTV. This new burst of success was probably the worst thing that could have happened to Rick, because more money meant more substances. This caused him to hit the pipe harder than he ever had before, and his life spiraled worse. He isolated and insulated himself in his home and refused to come out. He was in complete darkness. He purposely put aluminum foil on all the windows to block out any light. The only times he ever came out was to get sex from one of his girlfriends, and then back inside he went. He started taking newer drugs that were doing so much damage to him. He took some substance that caused him to black out, and when he came to, he was found in the snow outside and had no clue how he got there. A woman found him on the street, and she brought him back to her house. As soon as Rick sobered up a little, immediately he wanted to screw her. She wanted to pray for him. He wanted to leave, and did. And so the cycle continued. He'd enter rehab, get clean for a short amount of time, and was right back on it. The longest time he stayed clean was for 3 months. He was messing up his career. He'd get on TV and forget lines, do no shows for his concerts, and all that mattered was getting high. When it was time for him to record a new album, he couldn't. He physically couldn't. He got in the studio and his voice was gone. He went to the hospital and the doctor told him his drug use had caused severe vocal damage and that if he used one more time, he'd never get it back again. Rick, of course, was freaked out about this. If he lost his voice, then he'd lose his career. In the meantime, Motown was about to go to war with him. Rick always wanted to make a political album, like Marvin Gaye did with What's Going On. Motown was staunchly against this, in the same way they were when Marvin did it. But just like Marvin, Rick rebelled and created the album anyway. It was called The Flag, and the flag flopped. And because Rick did this, Motown got petty and tried to steal the Mary Jane Girls from him. Rick sued them, and in return, they sued him. They were in litigation for 4 to 6 years. This caused him to relapse, and he went right back to using. His career hit a major decline. He'd burned so many bridges that no one wanted to work with him. He was broke by now and only staying afloat because he wrote songs for his girlfriend at the time, a model named Marite. Her sugar daddy paid Rick to write some music for her, but she was a flop and nothing became of their messy union. Such a messy situation. During this time, his relationship with Tanya Ijazi got closer. In 1988, Rick had turned 40 years old. His life and career were in turmoil. He was completely broke and had fallen out with his family. He was no longer on speaking terms with his brother Roy because Roy was in charge of his estate as power of attorney, and he didn't allow Rick access to any money he had left over, which wasn't much. Then, he was no longer talking to his sister because he'd put hands on her as well for not giving him any money, because he and Motown were in a legal battle. For all those years suing each other, Motown had frozen all of his royalties. This was Berry Gordy's signature move whenever he was at odds with his artists. But luckily for Rick, after so many years, he won the lawsuit against Motown, and Motown owed him all his royalties. Rick made sure to pay off all his debts, and paid off anyone he had any debts to. Afterwards, he took his remaining money and went on vacation, because of course he did. He also went shopping for another record label. He'd passed up on Elektra and Arista Records, but the one record label agreed to take Rick on was Warner Brothers, none other than his rival's Prince record label. Big mistake. Because of the success of their artist Prince's success, they wanted to shape Rick into another Prince clone, or they wanted him as wild as he'd been in the past. Problem is, Rick at the time had sobered up, and after Warner's gave him an $850,000 advance, Rick relapsed, using the money to cop what he knew best: substances. After his girlfriend's mom prayed with him all night long, praying that he'd be released from the bondage of drugs, Rick felt like God had his hands on him once again, that he belonged to the Lord, and in turn he wanted to make a gospel album. Warner's Brothers was pissed. This is not what they signed him for. They wanted the super freak. Benny Medina said they wanted funk, not faith. So they decided to sue because they wanted a certain type of album from him. So to avoid the legal hassle, Rick reluctantly created the album called Wonderful, and it was very Prince-inspired, even with the way his image was. Rick felt like he'd sold out and let God down. This album was pretty much a flop anyway, and the only hit he had on it was a song called Lucy's Rap. Then he was forced back into the studio to do another album for Warner's, and this one was so bad that it went unreleased. So it was official, Rick James was washed. Until 1990 came and Rick had a resurgence he probably couldn't have ever imagined. MC Hammer's massive hit single, You Can't Touch This, was so big that it made MC Hammer a household name and major rap pop star. And Rick James sued him. Rick sued MC Hammer for writing credits for Hammer using the sample of his song, Super Freak. When MC Hammer won a Grammy for You Can't Touch This, this allowed Rick to win his very first and only Grammy. He was flying high again, but as he was soaring, his world was about to come crashing down quickly. Firstly, in 1991, his beloved mother Betty was diagnosed with cancer, and he was completely devastated by this. The self-proclaimed mama's boy, he always said how his mother was his first love, so seeing her dying right before his very eyes was too much to bear. 8 times a day, he began taking a substance that was causing him to lose his memory. This would cause a major issue in the crime that would bring Rick James down. After the passing of his mother, Rick claims he went off the rails in the worst ways possible. Not only did he increase his drug use, as if that was any more possible, but his sexual activities became depraved. Rick now was screwing anything that was moving, and no, it didn't have to be human if you catch my drift. Rick likened his life to that of the Roman Emperor Caligula and the Marquis de Sade. Everything was extreme sin to the highest power. Anything dark or sinister or depraved, the more into it he was. And it was this list of depravity that allowed the public to see how depraved he truly was. Rick James was already spiraling, consumed by a lifestyle of excess that had long since crossed the line from indulgence to destruction. The drugs were no longer just fuel for his creativity, they were a prison, warping his mind and turning his once charismatic energy into something darker. He was becoming beyond reckless, putting his hands and feet on literally any and everyone, including his daughter. One day, his daughter Ty and the lead singer of his group, the Mary Jane Girls, they decided they wanted to do an intervention with Rick. They wanted to get him back into rehab and let him know how much he was hurting them by throwing his life away with substances. Well, they picked a terrible day to do this because immediately Rick, who was fiending at the time, began throwing heavy objects at them. He started throwing books at their heads, causing them to have to run and duck. One of them threw a book back at him, which made him angrier, and he threw a heavy glass candle holder at his daughter, and it shattered her foot. That's when they realized they couldn't do anything with him. If he wanted help, he'd have to do it himself. And if that wasn't bizarre enough, things would only get worse. And in the summer of that year, his chaos reached a terrifying peak. The victim was a young woman named Frances Alley, a woman Rick and his girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, had invited to their secluded Hollywood Hills home. At first, it was just another drug-fueled party, music, laughter, and the haze of crack cocaine hanging in the air. But as the hours dragged on, that energy shifted. The party ended, but Frances wasn't allowed to leave. For 3 days, Rick and Tanya allegedly held her captive, a prisoner to their drug-induced paranoia and sadistic impulses. They reportedly bound her, beat her, and burned her with the hot end of a crack pipe. The glass seared her skin, leaving marks of pure agony. Each time she screamed, Rick would reportedly laugh, his once playful, mischievous cackle now a chilling sound of cruelty. Frances later described the ordeal as a waking nightmare. The demented couple forced her to perform depraved acts on them and beat her more if she refused. She also claimed Rick would go through unpredictable mood swings, one moment apologizing, the next exploding into rage. The drugs had consumed him, leaving only a shadow of the funk legend he once was. 3 days of hell, until she finally managed to escape, but that wasn't the end. But according to Rick, this didn't happen at all, or at least not the way Frances said it did. Remember when I said Rick said a drug he was using 8 times a day was causing him to lose his memory? Well, according to Rick, because he was dealing with the after effects of losing his mother and spiraling out of control, he and Tanya went scouting for heavy substances. They'd actually spent days in search of the high, and during their search, according to Rick, they found a sexy blonde woman that he thought was a prostitute, because he said she seemed like a freak, seemed just as much into women as he was. He and Tanya invited her back to their home for a party and ultimately a threesome. Also, according to Rick, she really enjoyed intercourse and the booger sugar, and that she agreed to stay for weeks. He claims after she finally left and went back to her pimp was furious that she'd returned and returned with no money, prompting him to beat her down and punish her by burning her with a crack pipe. Either way, after escaping, Frances called Tanya and told her that she was really messed up and was going to the emergency room. While she was there, the doctors and nurses knew something heinous had gone down, and the police were called. Casually, Rick suggested to Tanya that perhaps they should clean up the house by quickly getting rid of the substances. It was a good thing they did, because soon the police were at their door. Rick and Tanya's lawyers told them to go to rehab immediately so that they can look good for the trial, and they agreed, but only after copping a weekend of high first. The couple made plans to fly to Maui, and before making their way to the airport, they bought some substances, 8 crack rocks. Problem is, they didn't know that they just copped from some undercover cops. While they were driving, they heard the sirens coming and saw the lights coming right behind them. Panicking and knowing that they just royally messed up, Rick made the quick decision to dispose of the substances. And if you thought he was just going to throw them out the window, then you were sadly mistaken. Rick quickly swallowed all 8 rocks. By the time the police pulled them over, they realized that the couple were clean. There were no drugs to be found. They let the couple go, and Rick and Tanya were able to make their trip to Maui scot-free. But that wasn't the end. And if you thought this couple were thick as thieves in their toxicity, then once again you're wrong, but only kinda. Just 5 months later, in December 1991, Tanya became pregnant with her 4th child, and the two broke up the very next month. During their breakup, Rick began messing with a new woman, a music executive by the name of Mary Sauger. He really liked Mary because, according to him, on top of her being a great businesswoman, she was also into booger sugar and threesomes. Well, because Rick and Tanya were constantly off and on in their relationship, and because Mary was now a part of their union, tensions were heavy around them. One day, while all 3 of them were at the St. James Club and Hotel in West Hollywood, she claimed he beat her so badly that she blacked out. But the way Rick explains it, it seems he felt he had a good reason to do so. In the hotel, Tanya and Mary were arguing, and during their altercation, allegedly, Mary kicked Tanya in her pregnant stomach. According to Rick, seeing this made him see red, and he beat Mary to the floor. He beat her until blood was gushing and she became unconscious. Then he actually passed out, too. When he came to, he saw Mary just sitting there, all banged up and battered, and the first thing he did was offer her booger sugar. Now, even though he claims she accepted it, she was still angry. So afterwards, she went behind his back to the police to press charges. Later on that day, while at home with Tanya, both were getting high and relaxing on the couch. Suddenly, Tanya started screaming at the top of her lungs. Startling Rick, she pointed to the TV screen, and on there it showed that both of them were wanted by the police. They dove outside and began hiding in the bushes. But when they saw that no one was around actively looking for them, they decided they needed to turn themselves in. But they agreed not to do so that day because it was Friday, and they didn't want to wait in jail over the weekend before seeing the judge. So because they wanted to make the best of their last weekend of freedom, they decided to do what exactly? Get high. They were so paranoid, though. They kept hiding behind bushes and closing the shades, feeling like they were being watched. In Monday, they turned themselves in, and just before doing so, Rick took a Valium to get 1 more ounce of high and to calm down. In the process, Tanya ended up losing the baby. And it's not sure if this was due to Mary kicking her in the stomach, or if it was all the drugs she was taking, but the baby was gone. Mary's claims mixed with France's allegations of the couple was making it look real dire for Rick and his girl, with both women claiming that the couple made both of them perform unspeakable acts while high on crack. It seems this time there would be no escape for Rick James. When police raided his home, they found cocaine, illegal weapons, and disturbing evidence of his crimes. He was arrested, booked, and ultimately charged with multiple felonies, including kidnapping, torture, and assault. Rick was facing life in prison. He tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. But still, somehow, even with these types of crimes attached to him, Rick still seemed to kind of get away easy with this. He was definitely facing life in prison, but he wasn't going to do anything even remotely close to that. On September 17, 1993, Rick was convicted of multiple felonies stemming from the 2 explosive incidents involving Frances Alley and Mary Sauger. He was sentenced to only 5 years and 4 months in prison. Tanya Hijazi, who pled guilty to assault in connection with the Frances case, was sentenced to 15 months, but she was able to get released early for good behavior, which made Rick proud. He felt responsible for getting her into this mess, and he wanted to see her free, and he also wanted to do something special for her. Because Tanya never snitched on Rick or threw him under the bus to protect herself, he promised her that he'd marry her when they got out. Apparently, that promise meant everything because during her release, Tanya went out and stole a pair of bridal shoes, thus getting herself rearrested. The Bonnie to his cracked-out Clyde really thought she had a wedding waiting. What she got was another charge. But while Tanya was getting locked back up over shoes, Rick was stuck in a deeper hole. The public had turned on him. The headlines were vicious, the evidence overwhelming, his reputation damaged. All he could do was wait out his skimpy time behind bars. But in no time, he was released in 1996 after serving about 2 years. And when he got out, he wasn't sure if the world still wanted anything to do with him. He felt everyone would see him as a has-been and, his worst nightmare, irrelevant. He decided to test it out. He tested the waters at a local show at the Hard Rock Cafe, and to his surprise, the crowd still screamed his name. That tiny spark of validation led to the release of his 1997 comeback album, Urban Rhapsody. It didn't set the charts on fire, but it marked a new chapter. He was going to make a comeback if his life depended on it, and it almost did. In 1998, another crack hit, literally. While performing in Denver, Rick was headbanging so hard on stage that a blood vessel ruptured in his neck, and he suffered a stroke. He was rushed to Cedars-Sinai and spent the next few years trying to recover from both the damage to his body and the destruction of his reputation. But Rick James wasn't done. Never one to stay down, Rick got help from a former protege that he helped over a decade ago. Eddie Murphy came to the rescue. In 1999, Rick made a cameo in Eddie Murphy's prison comedy life, playing the outrageous pimp Spanky Johnson. It was a blink-and-you-miss-it moment, but for Rick, it meant the world. And then came the moment that would change everything. Again. 2004. Dave Chappelle drops one of the most iconic sketches in comedy history. "I'm Rick James, bitch." And the world exploded. The memes, the merchandise, the jokes. Suddenly, Rick James was relevant again, a pop culture phoenix. But the newfound attention didn't come without consequences. The sketch reignited Rick's ego. And for a man with a history of addiction and no real structure, that kind of sudden spotlight was gasoline. In no time, Rick relapsed. He'd been attending lots of Hollywood parties and partying like it was 1979 again, and the hangers-ons and drugs were plentiful, but this time it was too much. On August 6, 2004, Rick James was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment. He was 56 years old. The coroner's report found 9 different drugs in his system, including cocaine, meth, Xanax, Valium, and Vicodin. His death was ruled as heart failure, but let's be real, his body just couldn't take the punishment anymore. The freak was gone. The legend was dead. And the final nail hadn't even been driven in yet, because in 2020, even after death, Rick James made headlines again. In 2020, a woman came forward and filed a lawsuit against Rick James's estate, alleging that he essayed her in 1979, when she was just 15 years old at a youth detention center in Buffalo, New York. The woman, who remained anonymous, claimed that James had visited the facility as part of a program and that he assaulted her in one of the dorm rooms. Since Rick James had already been dead for 16 years by the time of the accusation, the lawsuit targeted his estate rather than him directly. The lawsuit was filed under the New York Child Victims Act, which temporarily lifted the statute of limitations on older cases of SA. This case stirred controversy. Some believed the woman's story, given James's well-documented history of violence, drug use, and legal troubles. Others questioned why she waited 4 decades to come forward, arguing that it was unfair to accuse a dead man who couldn't defend himself. Regardless, the lawsuit added another dark chapter to Rick James' already troubled legacy, reinforcing the image of a man whose talent was constantly overshadowed by his demons. Even in the grave, Rick James was still facing his demons. He called himself the king of punk funk, a rebel, a freak, a genius, and a menace. He lived like a god, sinned like a devil, and fell like a man with no parachute. Rick James was brilliant, but he was broken. He gave us hits and horrors, pleasure and pain. He left behind a legacy steeped in glitter, cocaine, and blood, and while the world danced to his madness, some didn't survive it. This has been part 3 of the Rick James saga. The end of a life that defied rules, rewrote fame, and left a body count. The man is gone. But the story is still screaming. I'm Rick James, bitch. So lurkers, what do you think? What do you think about the wild and freaky life of Rick James? Have you ever heard of any of these stories? Has your feelings about him changed at all since listening to this 3-part series? Do you feel sorry for the animals Rick had relations with? Let me know down below.